Our little corner of suburbia, Harmony Glade, was usually anything but. The name was a developer's cruel joke, I suspected. Picture-perfect lawns, yes, but simmering beneath the surface was the constant low-grade warfare of HOA regulations, passive-aggressive neighborhood watch emails, and the eternal struggle for the best Christmas light display that we weren't always at each other's throats. Mind you, block parties were civil. If a little forced, we collectively mourned Mr. Henderson's prize-winning roses when the deer finally got to them. But the undercurrent of tension was always there, a tightly wound spring just waiting for the slightest pressure to unleash it. And lately, the pressure had been building. The new architectural guidelines were a major point of contention that Mrs. Davison's flamingo collection on her front lawn, a beloved neighborhood landmark, was suddenly deemed in violation of aesthetic uniformity. Then there was the great mailbox debacle of 23, where the HOA mandated uniform black mailboxes, sparking outrage from those who preferred the classic Americana charm of their weathered, flag-adorned originals. That I, as the newly elected HOA president, a role I'd inherited more than sought, was caught squarely in the middle, fielding complaints and trying to navigate the treacherous waters of suburban discontent. So, yeah, Harmony Glade, peaceful on the surface, but with a definite edge, and that edge was about to be sharpened to a razor point on this particular Tuesday afternoon. It started with the sirens. Distant at first, a faint wail carried on the breeze, but they grew louder, closer, until they were an ear-splitting shriek that cut through the carefully curated tranquility of our little community. My heart clenched. Sirens that close rarely meant anything good. I peered through my living room window, trying to pinpoint the source. Then I saw it. The flashing lights of an ambulance, parked directly in front of old Mr. Peterson's house. 2 doors down. Mr. Peterson, bless his heart, was practically a fixture on his porch swing, always ready with a wave and a Werther's original. He wasn't exactly young. A wave of anxiety washed over me. I hoped he was all right. I started to head outside to see if I could offer any assistance. I heard another sound, one far more irritating than the now idling ambulance. The unmistakable screech of Karen, and I knew, with a sinking feeling, that this was going to be one of those days. The ambulance was a behemoth of white and red, its flashing lights painting frantic strokes across the manicured lawns and perfectly symmetrical houses. The paramedics, 2 figures clad in navy blue, moved with a practiced efficiency that spoke volumes about the urgency of the situation. One disappeared inside Mr. Peterson's house, while the other retrieved a large medical bag from the back of the vehicle. My stomach churned with a cocktail of worry and morbid curiosity. Mr. Peterson was a kind soul, always offering a smile and a wave. He'd even defended my questionable choice of garden gnomes at the last HOA meeting, earning him a permanent spot in my good graces. The thought of something serious happening to him, it just didn't sit right. I watched as another neighbor, Sarah Miller from across the street, cautiously approached the ambulance. She had a casserole dish covered in foil in her hands, the universal symbol of suburban sympathy. I saw her speak briefly to the paramedic, her face etched with concern, before being politely turned away. The air crackled with unspoken anxieties. Everyone in Harmony Glade, it seemed, was holding their breath, waiting for news, bracing for the worst. Even the birds had gone silent, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The only sound, besides the low hum of the idling ambulance, was the ever-increasing volume of that voice. It was a high-pitched, nasal whine that could curdle milk. At 50 paces. A voice that could cut through steel, a voice that, it was Karen, and she was not happy. I saw her emerge from her house, a whirlwind of perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer sunglasses perched precariously on her nose, and a brightly colored yoga outfit that screamed, "I spend more on athleisure than you do on groceries." Even from my vantage point, I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. She marched purposefully towards the ambulance, her face a mask of barely suppressed rage. This wasn't the concerned neighbor offering assistance. This was a suburban warrior, ready to wage war on anyone who dared inconvenience her. I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that whatever fragile peace we had managed to maintain in Harmony Glade was about to be shattered. Mr. Peterson's health crisis was about to become a sideshow in the Karen show, and I, as the unfortunate HOA president, was about to have a front row seat that I braced myself. This was going to be a long afternoon. Karen. Her real name was Deborah, but everyone called her Karen. It was a silent, collective agreement. A label that perfectly encapsulated her particular brand of entitlement and suburban tyranny. She was the queen of complaining, the champion of nitpicking, the undisputed ruler of ridiculous demands. If there was a minor infraction, a perceived slight, or an opportunity to exert her self-proclaimed authority, Karen was there, ready to pounce. Her hair, a helmet of meticulously styled blonde, never seemed to have a single strand out of place. Her sunglasses, perpetually perched on her nose, shielded her eyes from the harsh realities of the world, allowing her to see only what she wanted to see. And her outfits, always perfectly coordinated and undoubtedly expensive, were a constant reminder of her perceived superiority. But it wasn't just her appearance. It was her presence. She exuded an aura of self-importance that could suck the oxygen out of a room. She moved with a deliberate purpose, as if the world owed her something, and woe betide anyone who got in her way. I'd had my own run-ins with Karen, of course. The time she complained about my slightly overgrown hedges. They were, admittedly, a little unruly. The time she reported me for putting my trash cans out 5 minutes early. The time she tried to get me fined for having a slightly mismatched welcome mat. Each encounter was a masterclass in petty grievances and unreasonable demands. But this was different. This wasn't about hedges or trash cans or welcome mats. This was about an ambulance, paramedics, and a potentially life-threatening situation. This was about common decency and basic human empathy. And yet, here she was, marching towards the ambulance like it was a rogue shopping cart blocking her path to the organic kale. As she approached the paramedics, her voice grew louder, sharper, more insistent that I couldn't make out the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, demanding, and utterly devoid of compassion. I saw the paramedic she was addressing, a young woman who looked barely out of her teens, went slightly, trying to maintain her composure. I knew I had to do something, that I couldn't just stand there and watch Karen harass these people while they were trying to save Mr. Peterson's life. I took a deep breath, straightened my slightly rumpled t-shirt, and prepared to intervene. It was time for the HOA president to step in. It was time to confront the Karen. I am so sorry to interrupt, Karen said, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that fooled absolutely no one. But this is completely unacceptable. The young paramedic, whose name tag read EMT Riley, blinked in confusion. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but we're in the middle of an emergency. We need to keep this area clear. Clear? Karen scoffed, her voice rising in pitch. Clear for what, exactly? So you can block my entire driveway. I have a very important appointment, and I am going to be late because of this inconsiderate parking. I winced. Inconsiderate parking? Mr. Peterson was probably fighting for his life, and all Karen cared about was her precious appointment. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Ma'am, EMT Riley repeated, trying to maintain her professional demeanor. We're trying to save someone's life. Your driveway is partially blocked. Yes, but we'll move the ambulance as soon as we can. It won't be long. Not long, not long enough. Karen shrieked, throwing her hands up in the air. I have a hair appointment. Do you have any idea how long it takes to get an appointment with Jean-Pierre? This is a disaster. A hair appointment. Of course. The fate of Harmony Glade rested on the perfectly sculpted coif of Karen's blonde helmet. Ma'am, with all due respect, EMT Riley said, her voice now laced with a hint of steel, a person's life is a little more important than your hair appointment. That was it. That was the line. I saw Karen's face turn a shade of red I didn't think was humanly possible. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pursed, and her entire body seemed to vibrate with indignation. How dare you? She hissed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at EMT Riley. How dare you speak to me like that? I am a taxpayer, and I deserve to be treated with respect. This is a private street, and you have no right to block my driveway. I am calling 911. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her phone, and started dialing. The audacity, the sheer, unadulterated Karen-ness of it all, was simply astounding. She was actually going to call 911 on the ambulance that was trying to save her neighbor's life. Because it was inconveniencing her hair appointment that I couldn't believe what I was witnessing, that I knew I had to stop her, but before I could even open my mouth, she started speaking into the phone. Yes, hello, 911. I need to report an emergency, a parking emergency. I took a step forward, finally finding my voice. Karen, seriously? You're calling 911? On an ambulance? They're trying to help Mr. Peterson. Karen, phone pressed to her ear, glared at me over the top of her sunglasses. This is none of your business. Narrator's name. I am reporting a legitimate obstruction. This vehicle is illegally parked and preventing me from leaving my property. Illegally parked? I repeated, incredulous. Mr. Peterson could be dying, and you're worried about illegally parked? He should have planned better, she snapped into the phone, then back at me. And frankly, the HOA should have designated emergency vehicle parking zones. This is a clear failure of leadership. I resisted the urge to facepalm. Emergency vehicle parking zones? In a residential neighborhood? Was she even listening to herself? 911. This is Deborah Miller. She continued into the phone, her voice regaining its saccharine sweetness. I am calling to report an illegally parked vehicle blocking my driveway at address. It's a medical transport vehicle, but I suspect it's operating without the proper permits. It's causing a significant disruption to my schedule, and I need it removed immediately. I could hear the 911 operator on the other end, calmly asking questions. Karen, however, was having none of it. She interrupted the operator repeatedly, emphasizing the urgency of her situation and the gross negligence of the ambulance crew. I have a very important appointment, she reiterated, and I am losing valuable time. This is causing me undue stress and emotional distress that I demand that this vehicle be removed immediately and that the individuals responsible be held accountable for their actions. She paused, presumably to let the gravity of her demands sink in. Then, she added, for good measure, and I want to file a formal complaint against the HOA for failing to address this ongoing parking issue. I couldn't take it anymore. This was beyond ridiculous. This was actively harmful. She was tying up emergency resources, harassing medical personnel, and generally making a complete and utter spectacle of herself. Karen, that's enough, I said, my voice rising in anger. You need to hang up the phone and let these people do their jobs. Mr. Peterson's life is more important than your hair appointment, or your driveway, or your ridiculous complaints about the HOA. She ignored me, continuing her tirade to the 911 operator. I expect immediate action. This is unacceptable. I am a valued member of this community, and I deserve to be treated with respect. It was time to pull out the big guns. It was time to remind Karen exactly who she was talking to. It was time to reveal my secret weapon, the power of the HOA presidency. Karen, I said, stepping directly in front of her, forcing her to break eye contact with the young EMT. I made sure my voice was calm, steady, and carried the weight of authority. I am the HOA president, and I'm telling you to hang up the phone, now. The effect was immediate. The color drained from Karen's face, leaving her looking like a startled ghost. Her perfectly sculpted jaw went slack, and her eyes widened behind her designer sunglasses. The saccharine sweetness vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. She stammered, But, the driveway. The driveway can wait, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. Mr. Peterson's health cannot. You are wasting emergency resources, harassing medical personnel, and making a complete fool of yourself. As HOA president, I am officially requesting, no, demanding, that you terminate this call immediately. I could practically see the gears turning in her head. The Karen operating system was clearly experiencing a critical error. She was caught in a logical paradox, her desire to assert her authority clashing head-on with the authority of the HOA, an entity she both revered and weaponized for her own petty grievances. But I already reported it, she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. To 911. Then tell them it was a mistake, I said, my patience wearing thin. Tell them you overreacted. Tell them anything. Just hang up the phone. She hesitated for another moment, her eyes darting back and forth between me, the ambulance, and the young EMT, who was watching the scene unfold with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Then, with a sigh of defeat, she finally relented. Yes, hello, she said into the phone, her voice trembling slightly. This is Deborah Miller again. I seem to have overreacted. The situation is under control. I no longer require emergency assistance. Please disregard my previous call. She hung up the phone, her face a mask of shame and humiliation. The transformation was remarkable. Just moments ago, she had been a force of nature, a suburban hurricane of entitlement and rage. Now, she was a deflated balloon, a shadow of her former self. But the damage was done. She had called 911, she had wasted precious time and resources, and she had revealed her true colors to the entire neighborhood. The question now was, what would happen next, now that the immediate crisis of the 911 call had been averted? A strange sort of quiet descended. Karen stood there, a picture of defeated entitlement, while EMT Riley exchanged a knowing glance with her partner, who had just emerged from Mr. Peterson's house. The tension, however, remained thick in the air. Looking back, the sheer absurdity of Karen's call was almost comical. IT was a masterclass in self-centeredness, a symphony of suburban outrage orchestrated around the minor inconvenience of a blocked driveway. Every word, every complaint, every demand dripped with a complete and utter lack of empathy. She hadn't asked about Mr. Peterson. She hadn't offered any assistance. She hadn't even acknowledged the fact that someone was in distress. All she cared about was her hair appointment and the perceived injustice of having her precious schedule disrupted, and the things she said. Illegally parked? A significant disruption to my schedule? Undue stress and emotional distress? It was like she was reading from a script written by a committee of disgruntled suburbanites, each vying for the title of most outraged. The most ridiculous part, perhaps, was her insistence that the HOA should have designated emergency vehicle parking zones. The image of meticulously painted parking spaces reserved solely for ambulances and fire trucks in our quiet little cul-de-sac was almost too much to bear. It was the kind of idea that could only be conceived by someone completely detached from reality, someone who viewed the world through the lens of their own self-importance. But beneath the humor, there was a darker undercurrent. Karen's call wasn't just ridiculous, it was dangerous. She had tied up emergency resources that could have been needed elsewhere. She had potentially delayed medical assistance for Mr. Peterson, and she had demonstrated a complete disregard for the well-being of her neighbor. Her actions were a stark reminder of the selfishness that can fester beneath the surface of even the most idyllic communities. They were a testament to the power of entitlement to blind people to the suffering of others, and they were a chilling example of what can happen when petty grievances are allowed to overshadow basic human decency. I knew that Karen's call would have repercussions, both for her and for the rest of Harmony Glade. The incident had exposed a deep rift in our community, a chasm between those who cared about others and those who only cared about themselves. And it was up to me, as the reluctant HOA president, to figure out how to bridge that gap. I realized then, with a clarity that surprised even myself, that simply telling Karen to hang up wasn't enough. The power of the HOA presidency wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about setting an example. It was about demonstrating what it meant to be a responsible member of our community. And right now, the best example I could set was to show Karen, and everyone else watching, that actions had consequences. The paramedics were still inside Mr. Peterson's house, working diligently. The neighborhood was still holding its breath, waiting for news. And Karen was still standing there, looking like a scolded child, her face flushed with shame. It was time to address the elephant in the room. It was time to make it clear that her behavior was unacceptable. And it was time to start the long, arduous process of rebuilding the fractured sense of community in Harmony Glade. I took a deep breath and walked towards Karen. Stopping a few feet away from her, I made sure my voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, but not so loud that it would disrupt the paramedics. Karen, I said, my voice firm but not accusatory. What you did was wrong. You wasted emergency resources, you harassed medical personnel, and you showed a complete lack of empathy for your neighbor. As HOA president, I cannot condone that kind of behavior. I paused, letting my words sink in. I saw several neighbors nodding in agreement, while others looked on with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. I understand that you were inconvenienced, I continued. But your inconvenience does not justify your actions. Mr. Peterson's health is far more important than your hair appointment or your driveway. or any other petty grievance you might have. I took another deep breath. This was the hard part. This was where I had to walk the line between holding Karen accountable and alienating her completely. I'm not going to fine you, Karen, I said, surprising myself with my own leniency. I'm not going to file a formal complaint, but I am going to ask you to do something that I'm going to ask you to reflect on your behavior, to consider the impact of your actions, and to make a conscious effort to be a better neighbor. I looked directly into her eyes, trying to gauge her reaction that I saw a flicker of something. Regret, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by a familiar defensiveness. And what if I refuse? She said, her voice barely audible. That I sighed that I had known it wouldn't be easy. Then I will have no choice but to consider further action, I said, my voice hardening slightly. But I sincerely hope it doesn't come to that, because I believe that even you, Karen, are capable of change. Before Karen could respond, the front door of Mr. Peterson's house opened, and the two paramedics emerged. They were carrying Mr. Peterson on a stretcher, his face pale and his eyes closed. The gravity of the situation, which Karen had so casually dismissed, was now starkly apparent. The neighborhood fell silent. All eyes were on Mr. Peterson as the paramedics carefully loaded him into the back of the ambulance. Sarah Miller, still clutching her casserole dish, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping, as if paying their respects to the ailing Mr. Peterson. Karen, however, remained unmoved. She stood there, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of defiance and embarrassment. It was as if she was determined not to show any sign of remorse, even in the face of such a sobering scene. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, Mt. Riley gave me a weary but grateful nod. Then she turned to Karen, her voice laced with a mixture of pity and disdain. I hope your hair appointment is worth it, ma'am, she said, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. Because you just made a whole lot of people's lives a lot harder. With that, she climbed into the ambulance, and the vehicle slowly pulled away from the curb, its sirens silent out of respect for Mr. Peterson's condition. The departure of the ambulance left a void in the air, a palpable sense of emptiness and unease. The neighborhood, which had been holding its breath for so long, finally exhaled, releasing a collective sigh of relief and apprehension. I turned back to Karen, my expression grim. Do you have anything to say? I asked, my voice low and steady. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around nervously. Then, she opened her mouth, as if to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she mumbled, I just wanted to get to my appointment. I shook my head in disbelief. Even now, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the enormity of her actions. Even now, she couldn't admit that she had been wrong. Go home, Karen, I said, my voice filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. Just go home. She didn't need to be told twice. She turned on her heel and scurried back to her house, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair bobbing with each step. As I watched her disappear inside, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held for Karen and for Harmony Glade. Had she learned anything from this experience? Would she change her ways? Or would she continue to be the same entitled, self-centered woman she had always been? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: the events of this day would forever alter the landscape of our little suburban community. The illusion of harmony had been shattered, and the cracks in our foundation had been exposed for all to see. The transformation in Karen's demeanor after I revealed my HOA presidency was truly remarkable. That it was like watching a cartoon character suddenly realize they'd walked off a cliff. The dawning horror, the frantic attempts to regain purchase, the inevitable plunge into the abyss of their own making. Before, she had been a force to be reckoned with, a suburban titan radiating self-importance and righteous indignation. Her voice had been sharp and commanding, her movements purposeful and assertive. She had been the picture of entitled rage, convinced of her own superiority and impervious to the concerns of others. But the moment I uttered those fateful words, I am the HOA president, the carefully constructed facade crumbled. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin as pale and lifeless as a porcelain doll. Her eyes, previously narrowed with anger, widened with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Her perfectly sculpted jaw went slack, and her perfectly glossed lips began to tremble. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was also psychological. The confidence that had defined her just moments before vanished, replaced by a palpable sense of panic. She stammered. She stuttered. She avoided eye contact. She was no longer the queen of Harmony Glade. She was just a scared, flustered woman who had made a terrible mistake. It was clear that the realization of her actions was finally sinking in. She had called 911 on an ambulance. She had harassed medical personnel, and she had done it all in front of the HOA president, the very person who held the power to make her life a living hell. The gears were turning in her head. I could see it. She was frantically trying to assess the damage, to calculate the potential consequences, to figure out a way to salvage the situation. But it was too late. The die had been cast. The damage was done. The irony of it all was almost too much to bear. Karen, who had always been so quick to weaponize the rules and regulations of the HOA, had now fallen victim to its authority. She had used the HOA as a tool to exert her control over others. But now, the HOA was about to be used against her. The expression on her face was priceless. It was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a dawning sense of horror. It was the look of someone who had finally realized that their actions had consequences, and that those consequences were about to come crashing down on them. Seeing the fear in Karen's eyes, I knew I had to tread carefully. My goal wasn't to humiliate her, or to exact revenge for all the petty grievances she had inflicted upon me over the years. My goal was to make her understand the gravity of her actions, and to prevent her from repeating them in the future. I took a deep breath and spoke in a calm, measured tone, making sure my words were clear and unambiguous. "Karen," I said, "I want you to understand the seriousness of what you've done. Calling 911 unnecessarily is not a trivial matter. It's a crime that you've wasted valuable emergency resources, potentially putting other people's lives at risk." I paused, letting my words sink in. I saw her eyes widen, and her lips tremble even more. She was starting to grasp the potential consequences of her actions, and the realization was clearly unsettling her. "Furthermore," I continued, "you harassed medical personnel who were simply trying to do their jobs. These people are dedicated to saving lives, and you treated them with disrespect and contempt. That is completely unacceptable." I saw a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a familiar defensiveness. But they were blocking my driveway," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Your driveway is not more important than someone's life, Karen," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "And even if it were, there are better ways to resolve the situation than calling 911 and harassing medical personnel." I proceeded to explain to her the potential consequences of her actions. I told her that she could be fined or even arrested for misusing emergency services. I told her that the paramedics could file a formal complaint against her, which could result in further legal action. And I told her that her actions had damaged her reputation in the community, perhaps irreparably. "Do you understand?" I asked, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the ground. It was clear that she was finally starting to understand the enormity of her mistake. I didn't realize," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. "Well, now you do," I said, my voice softening slightly. "And I hope you'll learn from this experience. I hope you'll think twice before calling 911 again, especially when it's for something as trivial as a blocked driveway." The floodgates opened. A torrent of stammered apologies and desperate justifications poured forth from Karen, each one more pathetic than the last. I really didn't mean to cause any trouble," she stammered, her eyes darting around nervously. "It's just, I've been so stressed lately. Work has been crazy, and my mother has been ill, and I just wasn't thinking clearly." It was a classic Karen move, deflecting blame, minimizing her actions, and trying to elicit sympathy. But I wasn't buying it. I'd seen this act before, and I knew it was just a performance. And I didn't realize it was Mr. Peterson," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I would never do anything to hurt Mr. Peterson. He's such a sweet man. I always bring him cookies at Christmas." Again, the attempt to minimize her actions and portray herself as a kind, caring person. But the image of Karen baking cookies for Mr. Peterson at Christmas was almost too absurd to contemplate. And the driveway really was blocked," she insisted, her voice regaining a hint of its former assertiveness. I couldn't get my car out. I had a very important appointment that I had to get my roots touched up. There it was, the hair appointment, the ultimate priority, the driving force behind all her selfish actions. It was just a misunderstanding, she pleaded, her eyes. I cut her off, raising my hand to silence her. Karen, enough. I don't want to hear any more excuses. You've said enough. As if on cue, the paramedics emerged from Mr. Peterson's house, carrying him on a stretcher. The sight of the elderly man, his face ashen and his body limp, was a stark reminder of the real emergency that Karen had been so callously disrupting. The stretcher wheels squeaked on the pavement as the paramedics carefully maneuvered Mr. Peterson towards the ambulance. His breathing was shallow and labored, and his eyes were closed. It was clear that he was in serious condition. The neighborhood held its breath, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and apprehension. Sarah Miller, still clutching her casserole dish, began to sob openly. Even the birds had fallen silent, as if paying their respects to the ailing Mr. Peterson. Karen, however, remained strangely detached. She stood there, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. It was as if she was watching a movie, rather than witnessing a real-life emergency involving her neighbor. The paramedics carefully loaded Mr. Peterson into the back of the ambulance, securing him to the stretcher and attaching various monitors and tubes. They worked with a practiced efficiency, their movements precise and coordinated. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, EMT Riley turned to Karen, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. I hope you're proud of yourself, she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. You almost delayed this man's medical care because you couldn't wait for your hair appointment. With that, she climbed into the ambulance, and the vehicle slowly pulled away from the curb, its sirens silent out of respect for Mr. Peterson's condition. The departure of the ambulance left a void in the air, a palpable sense of emptiness and unease. The neighborhood, which had been holding its breath for so long, finally exhaled, releasing a collective sigh of relief and apprehension. I turned back to Karen, my expression grim. Now do you understand? I asked, my voice low and steady. Do you understand what you've done? She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around nervously. Then, she opened her mouth, as if to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she mumbled, I just wanted to get to my appointment. Let's rewind a bit. While I said Karen remained strangely detached, that wasn't entirely accurate. There was a flicker, a subtle shift in her expression as Mr. Peterson was being loaded into the ambulance. It wasn't remorse. Not exactly, but something akin to dawning comprehension. She had seen Mr. Peterson on the stretcher, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow. She had seen the paramedics working with urgency and precision, their faces etched with concern, and she had heard EMT Riley's scathing words, words that were meant to sting and clearly did. For the first time, I think, Karen truly grasped the reality of the situation. It wasn't just about a blocked driveway or a missed hair appointment. It was about a real person, a neighbor, a member of her community, fighting for his life. And she had almost made it worse. The weight of that realization, I believe, began to settle upon her shoulders. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic transformation, but a slow, creeping awareness that her actions had consequences, and that those consequences could be devastating. She had seen Mr. Peterson countless times before, sitting on his porch swing, waving to passersby. She had probably even exchanged pleasantries with him on occasion, but she had never really seen him, not as a person, not as a human being with his own hopes, dreams, and fears. Now, as she watched him being loaded into the ambulance, she finally saw him, and what she saw, I suspect, was a reflection of her own selfishness and lack of empathy. The image of Mr. Peterson on the stretcher, his face pale and vulnerable, would likely haunt her for a long time to come. It would serve as a constant reminder of the day she almost put her own petty concerns above the well-being of her neighbor. Whether that image would be enough to change her behavior in the long run remained to be seen. But I hoped, for her sake and for the sake of Harmony Glade, that it would. I hoped that she would learn from this experience and that she would become a more compassionate and understanding member of our community. As the ambulance disappeared around the corner, its taillights fading into the distance, I turned my attention back to Karen. She was still standing there, frozen in place, her eyes fixed on the spot where the ambulance had been. I approached her cautiously, unsure of what to expect. She seemed to be lost in thought, perhaps finally grappling with the enormity of her actions. "Karen," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "I think it's time we had a serious conversation about your behavior." She didn't respond, so I continued. "As HOA president, I have a responsibility to ensure that all members of our community adhere to certain standards of conduct. And frankly, your actions today fell far short of those standards." I paused, giving her a chance to respond, but she remained silent, her eyes still fixed on the distance. "I'm not going to fine you or file a formal complaint," I said, repeating my earlier statement. "But I want you to know that your actions could have had serious repercussions. You could have been arrested for misusing emergency services. You could have faced legal action from the paramedics. And you've certainly damaged your reputation in this community." I took a deep breath. This was my last chance to get through to her. "I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, Karen," I said, "but I am going to urge you to reflect on what happened today. Think about the impact of your actions on others, and to make a conscious effort to be a better neighbor." I paused again, waiting for a response, but she remained silent, her expression unreadable. "I sincerely hope you'll take my words to heart," I said, "because if you don't, I'm afraid I'll have no choice but to consider further action, and that's something I'd really rather avoid." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing alone in the street. I had said what I needed to say. Now, it was up to her to decide what to do with it. Walking back towards my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in Harmony Glade. The events of the afternoon had exposed a darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface for far too long. That it wasn't just about Karen. It was about the underlying tensions, the petty grievances, the lack of empathy that had come to define our community. It was about the skewed priorities that had led us to value perfectly manicured lawns over basic human decency. That I knew that changing things wouldn't be easy. It would require a concerted effort from everyone in Harmony Glade, a willingness to put aside our differences and work towards a common goal. That it would require us to confront our own biases and prejudices, and to embrace a more compassionate and understanding worldview. But I also knew that it was possible. That I had seen glimpses of hope, moments of kindness and generosity. Even in the midst of the chaos, I had seen Sarah Miller offering her casserole dish, and EMT Riley showing her compassion for Mr. Peterson. And I had seen the neighbors nodding in agreement as I confronted Karen, a sign that they, too, were tired of the petty squabbles and the lack of empathy. As I reached my front door, I glanced back at Karen's house. The lights were on, but the curtains were drawn. That I wondered what she was doing, what she was thinking. Was she reflecting on her actions, as I had urged her to do, or was she simply stewing in her own self-pity? I sighed. Only time would tell, but I knew that, regardless of what Karen did, I would continue to work towards building a better community in Harmony Glade. That I would continue to advocate for empathy, understanding, and compassion. And I would continue to remind everyone that we are all in this together. Whether I was filled with weary resignation or genuine hope, I couldn't quite say. Perhaps it was a bit of both. But one thing was certain. The events of this day had changed me. That I was no longer just the reluctant HOA president. I was a champion for change, a voice for reason, and a beacon of hope in the heart of suburban darkness. And I wouldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. The immediate aftermath was interesting, to say the least. The Harmony Glade grapevine, usually reserved for updates on suspicious squirrels and misplaced lawn ornaments, buzzed with unprecedented ferocity. The HOA email list exploded with messages, ranging from outraged condemnations of Karen's behavior to surprisingly supportive messages for Mr. Peterson and even, somewhat cautiously, for me. There were, as expected, a few formal complaints filed against Karen. Mrs. Davison, still smarting from the flamingo incident, led the charge, citing Karen's callous disregard for human life and demanding her immediate expulsion from the HOA. Others followed suit, listing a litany of past grievances, from minor parking infractions to accusations of excessive leaf blowing. To my surprise, however, the HOA board decided against any formal sanctions. They cited the fact that Karen had retracted her 911 call, and that I, as HOA president, had chosen not to pursue further action. There was a sense, I think, that punishing Karen too harshly would only exacerbate the divisions in the community, and that a more restorative approach might be more effective. Karen herself became a recluse. She rarely left her house, and when she did, she avoided eye contact with her neighbors. Her perfectly manicured lawn became slightly overgrown, and her perfectly coordinated outfits were replaced by more subdued attire. It was as if she had retreated into herself, shrinking from the judgment of the community. Her reputation, of course, was shattered. She was no longer the queen of Harmony Glade, but a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors. Children were told to be nice, or they would end up like that lady who called 911 on the ambulance. Some neighbors, surprisingly, offered her a measure of sympathy. Sarah Miller, ever the kind soul, baked her a casserole, a different one, of course, not the one she had brought for Mr. Peterson. And a few others sent her cards, expressing their hope that she would learn from her mistake and rejoin the community. Whether she did or not, I never found out. A few months later, Karen put her house on the market and moved away. Harmony Glade breathed a collective sigh of relief, and life returned to something resembling normal. But the memory of that day, the day Karen called 911 on the ambulance, lingered like a faint, unpleasant odor, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most idyllic communities. But what about Mr. Peterson? In all the drama and recriminations, it was easy to lose sight of the fact that this whole mess started with his medical emergency. I'm happy to report that Mr. Peterson made a full recovery. It turned out he had suffered a mild heart attack, but thanks to the quick response of the paramedics, he was able to get the treatment he needed in time. That he spent a few weeks in the hospital, and when he finally returned to Harmony Glade, he was greeted as a hero. Neighbors lined the street to welcome him home, waving signs and cheering as his car pulled up to his house. Sarah Miller, of course, was there with another casserole, and even I managed to bake him a batch of my, admittedly mediocre, chocolate chip cookies. Mr. Peterson was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. He had always been a beloved member of the community, but he had never realized just how much people cared about him. He told me later that the experience had changed his perspective on life. He had always been a bit of a worrier, fretting about minor inconveniences and letting petty grievances get him down. But now, he realized that those things didn't matter. What mattered was family, friends, and community. He became an even more active member of Harmony Glade, volunteering for various committees and organizing neighborhood events. He even started a kindness club, encouraging residents to perform random acts of kindness for their neighbors. And what about Karen? Did Mr. Peterson hold a grudge against her for almost delaying his medical care? Surprisingly, noted he told me that he felt sorry for her, that he believed she was a deeply unhappy person who needed help. He even tried to reach out to her, sending her a card and inviting her to join the kindness club, but she never responded. In the end, Mr. Peterson's heart attack, while a terrifying experience, served as a catalyst for positive change in Harmony Glade. It reminded us of what really matters in life, and it inspired us to be better neighbors and better human beings. And in a way, even Karen played a role in that transformation. Her selfish actions, while reprehensible, served as a stark reminder of what can happen when empathy and compassion are replaced by entitlement and self-interest. So, while the story of Karen and the ambulance may seem like a tale of suburban dysfunction, it's also a story of hope, resilience, and the power of community, and it's a story that I will never forget.